The fluorescent lights in the pediatric ward flicker intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the sterile white walls. Dr. Sarah Chen moves quietly through the hallway, her worn sneakers making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. At 28, she carries herself with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to navigate between hope and heartbreak on a daily basis. Her stethoscope hangs around her neck like a familiar weight, the metal cool against her skin even through her scrubs. The fabric, once a vibrant turquoise, has faded from countless washings, small stains marking the places where tiny hands have reached out in moments of fear or comfort. Sarah pauses outside room 314, checking the chart clipped to her tablet. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia complications. The family's insurance had lapsed when her father lost his job at the textile mill, but Sarah had insisted they admit the child anyway. Hospital administration wouldn't be pleased, but some battles were worth fighting. The rain outside intensifies, drumming against the tall windows that line the corridor. Each droplet races down the glass like tears, and Sarah finds herself thinking about her own childhood, about nights spent in similar hallways while her grandmother fought battles that medicine couldn't win. She takes a deep breath and pushes open the door to Emma's room. The space is cramped, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. A single bed dominates the center, surrounded by monitors that beep softly in rhythm with a small heart that beats too fast. Emma lies propped up against thin pillows, her dark hair spread across the white fabric like spilled ink. Her mother, Maria, sits in a plastic chair beside the bed, her calloused hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Buenos dias," Sarah says softly, approaching the bed with a gentle smile. "How are we feeling this morning, Pequeña?" Emma's eyes flutter open, fever-bright but alert. "My chest doesn't hurt as much," she whispers, her voice still raspy from the infection. Sarah nods, pulling out her stethoscope. "That's excellent news. Let's have a listen, shall we?" As she examines Emma, Sarah notices Maria watching every movement with the intensity of someone who has learned that vigilance is the price of keeping those you love safe. The woman's clothes are clean but worn, her wedding ring turned inward to hide the places where the gold has worn thin. "Doctor," Maria says quietly, "when can we take her home?" Sarah finishes her examination, noting the improvement in Emma's breathing. Her lungs are clearing nicely. If she continues to improve, perhaps by tomorrow. Relief floods Maria's face, but it's quickly replaced by something else, a tightening around her eyes that Sarah recognizes all too well. "Is there something else troubling you?" Sarah asks, settling into the chair on the other side of Emma's bed. Maria hesitates, glancing at her daughter who has drifted back to sleep. "The bills," she admits, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have insurance right now, Anne." "Don't worry about that," Sarah interrupts gently. "There are programs available. We'll figure something out." But even as she says the words, Sarah knows the reality. The hospital's charity care fund is stretched thin, and families like the Rodriguez family often fall through the cracks. She's seen it too many times, good people forced to choose between their health and their homes. The morning passes in a blur of rounds and consultations. Sarah checks on the twins in room 301, born premature but fighting with the fierce determination that never fails to amaze her. She comforts 5-year-old Tyler, whose asthma attack had brought him to the emergency room in the early hours of the morning. Each patient carries a story, a family, a weight that Sarah finds herself shouldering alongside her medical training. By noon, the rain has stopped, leaving the world outside looking washed clean and new. Sarah steps out onto the small balcony adjacent to the break room, grateful for a moment of fresh air. The city stretches out below her, a patchwork of neighborhoods divided by invisible lines of opportunity and circumstance. If this story of unexpected kindness is touching your heart, imagine how many more are waiting. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories and join a community that believes in the power of human connection. Hit that notification bell, you won't want to miss what happens next. Her phone buzzes with a text from her roommate, "Rent notice came today. Need your half by Friday or we're out." Sarah closes her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of financial pressure settling on her shoulders. Medical school loans, her grandmother's funeral expenses from 2 years ago, the cost of living in a city where even the smallest apartments command premium prices, it all adds up to a monthly juggling act that grows more precarious with each passing month. She thinks about the Rodriguez family, about Maria's worried face and the bills that will inevitably come. She thinks about her own bank account, already stretched thin from helping her brother with his college tuition. Sometimes caring for others means neglecting yourself, but Sarah has never been able to turn away from someone in need. The afternoon brings a new admission, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus whose mother, Janet, paces the waiting room with the restless energy of someone balancing 3 jobs and a sick child. Sarah recognizes the signs, the coffee stains on Janet's uniform, the phone that keeps buzzing with calls she can't answer, the way she keeps glancing at the clock on the wall. "I need to get back to work," Janet explains when Sarah approaches with Marcus's treatment plan. "I already missed my morning shift, and if I miss another, we'll take good care of him," Sarah assures her. "Children's Services isn't involved here, but do you have anyone who can stay with Marcus?" Janet's face crumples slightly. "His grandmother is in Memphis, and my sister, she's dealing with her own problems right now." Sarah makes a decision that goes against hospital protocol. "I'll check on him personally every hour. You go to work, and we'll call if anything changes." Relief and gratitude war across Janet's features. "Thank you," she whispers, pressing a crumpled $20 bill into Sarah's hands. "For the vending machine or whatever he needs." Sarah wants to refuse the money. She knows how precious those $20 are to a single mother working multiple jobs, but she understands that refusing would rob Janet of her dignity. Instead, she accepts it with a solemn nod, already planning to use her own money and return Janet's untouched. The evening shift brings its own challenges. Dr. Williams, the head of pediatrics, makes his rounds with the efficiency of someone who has learned to see patients as medical problems rather than people. He pauses at Emma's chart, frowning at the notation about the family's insurance status. "Dr. Chen," he says, his voice carrying the weight of institutional policy, "we need to discuss appropriate discharge planning for patients without coverage." Sarah meets his gaze steadily. "Emma Rodriguez will be ready for discharge tomorrow, assuming her condition continues to improve." "And the financial arrangements?" "I'm working with social services to identify appropriate resources." Dr. Williams studies her for a long moment, and Sarah can see him weighing the hospital's financial interests against the reputation she's built for thorough, compassionate care. Finally, he nods curtly and moves on to the next chart. That night, after her shift ends, Sarah sits in her car in the hospital parking garage, too tired to start the engine. Her phone displays a bank balance that makes her stomach clench with anxiety. The numbers don't lie, she's 3 weeks away from her own financial crisis, and yet she can't stop thinking about the families upstairs who are facing situations far worse than her own. She thinks about Emma's fevered eyes, about Marcus asking when his mother would return, about the dozen other children she's treated this week whose families are struggling with medical bills that could bankrupt them. The system feels broken, and she's just one person trying to hold together the pieces. The rain starts again, gentle this time, creating rivulets on her windshield that catch the amber light from the parking garage fixtures. Sarah finally turns the key and begins the drive home to her cramped apartment, already mentally preparing for another day of walking the tightrope between medical care and financial reality. The next morning brings unexpected news. Emma's fever has broken completely, her breathing is clear, and her energy is returning. Sarah finds her sitting up in bed, coloring in a book that one of the nurses had provided, her mother beaming with relief beside her. "She's ready to go home," Sarah announces, and Maria's eyes fill with tears of gratitude. But as Sarah begins the discharge paperwork, her tablet chimes with a message from the billing department. The Rodriguez family's total charges have reached $47,000, a sum that might as well be $47 million for a family whose primary breadwinner has been unemployed for 3 months. Sarah stares at the numbers, feeling a familiar anger rise in her chest. This is a little girl whose only crime was getting sick. This is a family whose only failing was trusting that hard work and good hearts would be enough to protect them from the arbitrary cruelties of a healthcare system that treats healing as a commodity. She makes another decision that could cost her job. Opening her computer, she begins typing notes about Emma's condition, carefully documenting medical necessity while subtly adjusting codes that will trigger automatic reviews for charity care. It's not fraud, everything she writes is medically accurate, but it's a creative interpretation of guidelines that could raise questions if anyone looks too closely. An hour later, as she's walking Emma and Maria to the discharge area, they encounter a commotion near the main lobby. A small crowd has gathered around a man in an expensive suit who appears to be arguing with hospital security. "This is completely unacceptable," the man is saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his problems solved immediately. My mother was supposed to be transferred to the cardiac unit an hour ago, and no one seems to know where she is. Sarah recognizes him immediately, Alexander Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, whose face regularly appears on the business pages of the local newspaper. His company employs half the city, and his family name graces the wing of the children's hospital where Sarah works. But as she watches him gesticulate impatiently at the security guard, Sarah sees something that gives her pause. Behind the expensive clothes and commanding presence, there's genuine fear in his eyes. This isn't a man throwing his weight around for sport, this is someone terrified of losing his mother. Sarah approaches quietly, Emma's hand still in hers. "Excuse me," she says to Alexander, her voice calm and professional. "Did you say your mother is supposed to be in cardiac?" Alexander turns to her, taking in her faded scrubs and the child beside her. "Yes, Margaret Morrison. She had chest pains this morning, and they said they were moving her for monitoring, but—" "I know where she is," Sarah interrupts gently. "There was a mix-up with bed assignments, but she's being well cared for. If you'd like, I can take you to her." Relief floods Alexander's face, transforming him from an angry executive into a worried son. "Thank you," he says, and Sarah hears genuine gratitude in his voice. She looks down at Emma, who is watching the exchange with curious eyes. "We'll walk you to the main entrance first, Pequena, then I'll help this gentleman find his mother." As they walk, Emma tugs on Sarah's scrub top. "Is his mama sick like I was?" "Sometimes grown-ups get sick too," Sarah explains gently. "And when they do, their children worry just like your mama worried about you." Alexander overhears this exchange, and something in his expression softens. He looks at Emma more carefully, noticing the hospital bracelet on her small wrist, the way she leans against her mother's leg for support. "What's your name?" he asks Emma, crouching down to her level. "Emma Rodriguez," she says shyly. "I had pneumonia, but Dr. Sarah made me better." "Dr. Sarah, is it?" Alexander glances up at Sarah, who feels heat rise in her cheeks at the informal title. "Emma likes to keep things simple," Sarah explains. They reach the main entrance, where Maria has called her husband to pick them up. As they wait, Emma pulls something from her pocket, a small wooden heart, roughly carved and painted red, the kind of craft project that occupies children during long hospital stays. "This is for you," Emma says to Sarah, pressing the heart into her hands. "Because you have the biggest heart of anyone I know." Sarah feels tears sting her eyes as she accepts the small gift. "Thank you, Emma. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Maria hugs Sarah tightly, whispering "Gracias, Doctora" in her ear before taking Emma's hand and walking toward the exit. Alexander watches this interaction with something approaching wonder. "She's not actually a doctor, is she?" he asks after the Rodriguez family has gone. "Nurse practitioner," Sarah corrects. But Emma doesn't worry about titles. "And she called you Dr. Sarah because sometimes what children need most is to believe that someone with the power to help them actually cares." Alexander studies Sarah's face, taking in the exhaustion around her eyes, the way she holds Emma's wooden heart like it's made of precious metal rather than painted wood. "My mother is in room 520, Sarah says, returning to her professional demeanor. "The elevator bank is just—" "Wait," Alexander interrupts. "I owe you an apology. I wasn't at my best down there." "You were scared," Sarah says simply. "Fear makes us all behave in ways we wouldn't normally choose." They walk toward the elevators in comfortable silence, and Sarah finds herself studying Alexander more closely. Without the aggressive posture from earlier, he looks younger, more vulnerable. There are shadows under his eyes that suggest he's been at the hospital longer than just this morning. "Has your mother been ill for a while?" Sarah asks as they wait for the elevator. 2 weeks, Alexander replies. "First it was just fatigue, then dizzy spells, and now chest pains. The doctors keep running tests, but no one will give me a straight answer about what's wrong." Sarah nods, recognizing the frustration of loving someone whose illness defies easy categorization. Uncertainty is often harder than a difficult diagnosis. At least with a diagnosis, you know what you're fighting. The elevator arrives, and as they ride up to the 5th floor, Alexander asks, "How long have you been working here?" 3 years. I started right after finishing my nurse practitioner program. And before that? Sarah hesitates, and used to personal questions from strangers. College, then nursing school. I grew up here in the city. Family? My grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She passed away 2 years ago. Sarah isn't sure why she's sharing this information, but something about Alexander's genuine concern for his mother makes her feel safe to be honest. I'm sorry, Alexander says quietly. That must have been incredibly difficult. She was an amazing woman. She taught me that taking care of people isn't just a job, it's a calling. The elevator opens on the 5th floor, and Sarah leads Alexander down a corridor lined with cardiac monitoring equipment. The atmosphere here is more intense than the pediatric ward, filled with the constant beeping of machines and the quiet urgency of nurses monitoring patients whose hearts are struggling to maintain the rhythms of life. They find Margaret Morrison in a private room overlooking the city. She's a petite woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, sitting up in bed despite the maze of wires and monitors surrounding her. When she sees Alexander, her face lights up with relief. There you are, she says, extending her arms for a hug. I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost. Alexander embraces his mother carefully, mindful of the 4 lines. I'm sorry I took so long. There was some confusion about which room you were in. Margaret looks over Alexander's shoulder at Sarah, who has remained respectfully near the doorway. And who is this lovely young woman? This is Sarah, Alexander says, turning to include her in the conversation. She helped me find you when the hospital staff couldn't locate your room. Sarah steps forward with a professional smile. I'm a nurse practitioner downstairs in pediatrics. I was just helping Mr. Morrison navigate the hospital. Margaret studies Sarah with the keen attention of someone who has spent decades reading people. You have kind eyes, she says simply. Alexander, this young woman has been up all night, hasn't she? Sarah blinks in surprise. How did you? I was a nurse for 40 years before I retired, Margaret explains with a gentle smile. I recognize the signs. The way you hold your shoulders, the careful way you move, you're running on determination and caffeine. Guilty as charged, Sarah admits. And you took time to help my son find me because someone who's worried about their mother deserves to know she's safe. Margaret nods approvingly. Alexander, I like her. Over the next hour, as they wait for test results, Sarah finds herself drawn into conversation with the Morrison family. Margaret regales them with stories from her nursing career, while Alexander reveals a side of himself that the business pages never capture, a son deeply devoted to his mother, a man who took over the family company not for power but because it was what his father would have wanted. What kind of work does your company do? Sarah asks during a lull in conversation. Manufacturing, primarily, Alexander explains. We make medical devices, heart monitors, insulin pumps, that sort of thing. Morrison Industries, Sarah says, recognition dawning. You make the pediatric monitors we use downstairs. Among other things, yes. Sarah thinks about all the children she's cared for whose lives have been monitored by equipment bearing the Morrison name. Your products have helped save a lot of lives. That's the idea, Alexander says modestly. My father started the company after my older brother was born with a heart defect. He wanted to create technology that would give other families the early warning systems that might have saved David. What happened to your brother? Sarah asks gently. Margaret reaches for Alexander's hand. David died when Alexander was 10. He was 3 years older, and he was Alexander's hero. I'm so sorry, Sarah says, understanding now the drive behind Alexander's success, the way he'd panicked when his mother's health was uncertain. It was a long time ago, Alexander says, but Sarah can hear the lingering grief in his voice. But it shaped everything our family does. We've donated millions to pediatric cardiac research, and our company gives away monitors to hospitals that serve low-income populations. Before Sarah can respond, Dr. Martinez enters with Margaret's test results. The news is cautiously optimistic, stress-related heart palpitations rather than a serious cardiac event, but Margaret will need to stay overnight for observation. You should go home and get some rest, Margaret tells Alexander as Dr. Martinez explains the monitoring protocol. I'll be fine here. I'm not leaving you alone, Alexander protests. You're not alone, Sarah interjects quietly. The cardiac nurses here are excellent, and I'll check on you myself during my rounds tomorrow. Margaret smiles at this offer. You see? I'll be perfectly safe. Alexander, you haven't slept in 2 days. Go home, shower, get some proper food, and come back this evening. After some discussion, Alexander reluctantly agrees. As they walk back toward the elevators, he turns to Sarah. Thank you for today. I don't know how to repay your kindness. You don't owe me anything, Sarah says. I'm just glad your mother is going to be okay. Still, Alexander persists, you went out of your way to help a stranger, and that means something. They part ways in the lobby, Alexander heading to his car while Sarah returns to the pediatric ward for her afternoon rounds. But as she checks on her young patients, she finds herself thinking about the Morrison family, about the way grief had shaped their mission to help others, about the parallels between their loss and her own. That evening, as Sarah is finishing her notes, she receives an unexpected visitor. Alexander stands in the doorway of the break room, holding a bouquet of flowers and looking uncertain. I hope you don't mind the interruption, he says. I wanted to thank you properly for today. Sarah looks up from her tablet, surprised by his appearance. How's your mother? Stable. The evening nurse says her heart rhythm has been normal all day. Alexander approaches tentatively, offering the flowers. These are for you. A small token of appreciation. Sarah accepts the bouquet, sunflowers mixed with white roses, and breathes in their fresh scent. They're beautiful, but you really didn't need to. I wanted to, Alexander interrupts. Today reminded me that kindness still exists in the world, even in places where you might not expect to find it. Kindness exists everywhere, Sarah says gently. Sometimes we just need to slow down enough to notice it. They talk for another few minutes, and Sarah finds herself enjoying Alexander's company. Stripped of his earlier panic and corporate demeanor, he's thoughtful and genuinely interested in her work. He asks intelligent questions about the challenges facing pediatric healthcare, and he listens to her answers with the attention of someone who genuinely cares about the problems she describes. I should let you get back to your patients, Alexander says eventually, glancing at the clock on the wall. Actually, my shift ended 20 minutes ago, Sarah admits. I was just finishing some paperwork. In that case, would you like to get coffee? There's a place down the street that I'm told makes excellent espresso. Sarah hesitates. It's been months since anyone has asked her out, her schedule and financial situation don't leave much room for dating, and she's not sure if this is a social invitation or simply Alexander's way of extending his gratitude. As friends, Alexander clarifies, apparently reading her uncertainty. I don't know many people who understand what it's like to spend your days worrying about other people's well-being. It would be nice to talk to someone who gets it. Sarah finds herself nodding. Okay. But somewhere casual, I'm not exactly dressed for fancy coffee shops. I know just the place. They end up at a small diner 6 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place where the coffee is strong, the pie is homemade, and the staff knows the names of regular customers. Sarah orders tea and apple pie, while Alexander gets black coffee and asks the waitress about her grandson's recovery from surgery. You come here often? Sarah asks, amused by the easy familiarity between Alexander and the staff. My father used to bring me here when I was young, Alexander explains. After David died, he'd pick me up from school sometimes and we'd come here to talk. The owner, Mrs. Chen. Chen? Sarah interrupts. That's my last name too. Really? Mrs. Chen is probably in her 70s now, retired but still comes in every day to supervise the pie making. Her granddaughter runs the place. As if summoned by their conversation, an elderly woman emerges from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She spots Alexander and her face creases into a smile. Alexander Morrison, she says, approaching their table. It's been too long since you've visited us. Mrs. Chen, Alexander stands to embrace the woman gently. I'd like you to meet someone. This is Sarah Chen, she's a nurse practitioner at the hospital. Mrs. Chen turns to study Sarah with keen eyes, taking in the faded scrubs, the tired posture, the wooden heart that Sarah unconsciously fingers in her pocket. Chen, the older woman repeats thoughtfully. What was your grandmother's name, dear? Lily Chen, Sarah says. She worked as a seamstress downtown for most of her life. Mrs. Chen's eyes widen. Lily was my cousin, she says, sitting down heavily in the empty chair at their table. I haven't seen her in, oh, it must be 15 years. She used to bring you here when you were small, you probably don't remember. Sarah stares at the woman, searching her memory for traces of this place, these faces. Suddenly, she does remember, dim recollections of sitting in a booth much like this one, coloring with crayons while her grandmother talked with someone in rapid Mandarin. You gave me fortune cookies, Sarah says suddenly. Special ones with custom fortunes that said things like you will be brave today and someone thinks you're wonderful. Mrs. Chen claps her hands together, delighted. You do remember. Your grandmother was so proud of you. She used to say you were going to grow up to take care of people, just like she took care of you. She was right, Alexander says quietly, watching the reunion with wonder. Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen shares stories about Sarah's grandmother that Sarah has never heard, how Lily had worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school before arthritis forced her to change careers, how she'd volunteered at the free clinic even after her hands could no longer handle medical procedures, how she'd talked constantly about her granddaughter who was going to be a healer. She never told me she wanted to be a nurse, Sarah says, tears gathering in her eyes. She didn't want you to feel pressured to follow in her footsteps, Mrs. Chen explains. But she was so happy when you chose that path on your own. The last time I saw her, just before she got sick, she said watching you care for others was like watching her own dreams come true. When they finally leave the diner, Sarah's mind is reeling from these revelations. Alexander walks her to her car in comfortable silence, both of them processing the unexpected connections that had emerged over pie and coffee. Thank you for tonight, Sarah says as they reach her car. I never knew those stories about my grandmother. Sometimes the universe has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time, Alexander says. Your grandmother sounds like an amazing woman. She was. She taught me that every life has value, regardless of someone's ability to pay for care. Alexander studies her face in the amber glow of the parking lot lights. That's a beautiful philosophy. It must be challenging to live by it in a system that doesn't always support those ideals. Some days are harder than others, Sarah admits. But I can't imagine doing anything else. They exchange phone numbers before parting, and Alexander promises to keep her updated on his mother's condition. As Sarah drives home, she finds herself thinking about the strange coincidences of the day, meeting Alexander through his fear for his mother, discovering her family connection to Mrs. Chen, the way their conversation had flowed so naturally despite their different backgrounds. The next few days pass in a blur of routine hospital duties, but Sarah finds herself looking forward to Alexander's text updates about Margaret's recovery. The messages are brief but warm, often including small details that suggest he's paying attention to the staff caring for his mother. Night nurse says mom charmed the dietary staff into bringing her extra chocolate pudding, one message reads. Apparently she told them she was recovering from a broken heart and needed therapeutic dessert. Sarah laughs, picturing Margaret's mischievous smile as she manipulates the hospital system through sheer charm rather than wealth or influence. On Friday afternoon, Sarah receives an unexpected summons to Dr. Williams' office. She sits across from his desk, trying to read his expression as he reviews her personnel file. Dr. Chen, he begins, and Sarah notes his use of her formal title, I've been reviewing your recent patient interactions. Sarah's stomach tightens. Has someone discovered her creative interpretation of billing codes? Has she been too generous with charity care authorizations? The Rodriguez family, Dr. Williams continues, their bill was processed through our charity care program. The application was unusually thorough. I helped them complete the paperwork, Sarah says carefully. Everything documented is medically accurate. I'm not questioning your documentation, Dr. Williams says, his tone unreadable. I'm curious about your motivation for going above and beyond your normal duties. Sarah takes a deep breath. Emma Rodriguez is 7 years old. Her only crime was getting sick in a family that couldn't afford insurance. If we can't find ways to help children like her, then what are we doing here? Dr. Williams leans back in his chair, studying her. You know that your salary doesn't allow for regular charitable donations to patient families. I'm not donating money, Sarah protests. I'm just making sure they know about all available resources. But you are donating time. Significant amounts of unpaid time helping families navigate systems that aren't designed to be user-friendly. Sarah nods slowly, wondering if this conversation is leading toward a reprimand or termination. There's been a development, Dr. Williams continues. We've received an anonymous donation specifically designated for pediatric charity care. A substantial sum that will allow us to help families like the Rodriguez family without impacting our operating budget. Sarah blinks in surprise. That's wonderful news. The donor specifically requested that fund administration be overseen by a medical professional who understands both clinical care and the human impact of financial barriers to treatment. That makes sense, Sarah agrees. They asked for you by name, Dr. Chen. Sarah stares at Dr. Williams, certain she's misunderstood. I'm sorry, what? The donor specified that they want Sarah Chen to oversee the charitable fund distribution. They were quite insistent that you have the judgment and compassion necessary to ensure the money reaches families who truly need assistance. But I don't understand. Who would? Sarah stops mid-sentence as realization dawns. How much was the donation? $2 million, Dr. Williams says. With the commitment of matching funds annually for the next 10 years. Sarah's head spins as she tries to process this information. And they specifically asked for me? They said you'd understand the mission because you'd lived it yourself. Dr. Williams slides a folder across his desk. This would be a significant addition to your current responsibilities, with appropriate compensation. You'd be developing protocols for need assessment, working with families to identify resources, essentially building a bridge between medical care and financial reality. Sarah opens the folder, scanning the job description and salary information. The pay increase alone would solve her own financial problems, but more importantly, it would allow her to help families systematically rather than through the guerrilla charity work she's been doing informally. Why me? She asks again. Apparently, someone has been watching your work and believes you're exactly the right person for this position. That evening, Sarah calls Alexander to share the news about his mother's successful stress test and upcoming discharge. She hesitates before mentioning the job offer, unsure whether her suspicions about the anonymous donor are correct. That's wonderful about the position, Alexander says when she finishes explaining the opportunity. It sounds perfectly suited to your skills and interests. It's an incredible opportunity, Sarah agrees. I'm just surprised that someone would donate such a large amount and specifically ask for me to oversee it. Maybe you've touched more lives than you realize, Alexander suggests. Sometimes the people we help find ways to pay it forward. They talk for another few minutes about Margaret's discharge plans and Alexander's relief at having his mother home safely. But after they hang up, Sarah finds herself staring at Emma's wooden heart, which now sits on her bedside table like a talisman. The following Monday, Sarah begins her new role as Director of Pediatric Family Services. Her first official act is approving emergency assistance for a family whose infant requires surgery they can't afford. Her second is establishing a protocol for identifying families in need before they reach crisis points. By Wednesday, she's helped 6 families access care that would otherwise have been financially impossible. Each success feels like a small victory against a system that too often treats healing as a luxury rather than a right. On Thursday evening, as Sarah is leaving the hospital after a particularly satisfying day, she encounters Alexander in the parking garage. He's leaning against his car, looking like he's been waiting for someone. Congratulations on your new position, he says as she approaches. I hear you're already making a significant impact. How do you hear things like that? Sarah asks, though she's smiling. Hospital boards are smaller communities than you might think, Alexander says cryptically. Walk with me? They stroll through the nearby park, following paths lit by old-fashioned street lamps. The evening air carries the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant sound of children playing. I have a confession, Alexander says as they settle on a bench overlooking a small pond. The anonymous donation wasn't entirely anonymous. Sarah turns to face him, unsurprised but curious. I wondered about that. After seeing your work with Emma's family, and hearing about other families you've helped, I realized that you were already doing the job, you just didn't have the resources to do it properly. So you decided to give me the resources. I decided to give the hospital the resources, with the stipulation that they be administered by someone who understands that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege. Sarah processes this information, touched by the gesture but also concerned about the implications. That's incredibly generous, but... No conditions, Alexander interrupts. No strings attached. This isn't about personal relationships or obligations. It's about recognizing that you were already fighting the good fight and deserved better weapons. They sit in comfortable silence, watching ducks glide across the pond's surface. Sarah thinks about the families she'll be able to help, the children who won't have to suffer because their parents can't afford treatment. Why healthcare? She asks eventually. Your company could donate to any cause. Alexander is quiet for a long moment. When David died, it wasn't because the technology didn't exist to save him. It was because the right equipment wasn't available in the small hospital where we lived. My parents always wondered if things would have been different if we'd had better access to pediatric cardiac care. So you've been trying to save David ever since? In a way, yes. Every child whose life is saved by equipment we manufacture, every family that receives care they couldn't otherwise afford, it's a way of honoring his memory. Sarah reaches into her pocket and pulls out Emma's wooden heart. A little girl gave this to me last week. She said I had the biggest heart of anyone she knew. She wasn't wrong. But seeing you with your mother, hearing about your family's mission, I think she might have been describing the wrong person. Alexander takes the wooden heart, turning it over in his hands. Maybe she was describing all of us. Maybe having a big heart isn't about being the single most compassionate person in the room. Maybe it's about recognizing compassion in others and finding ways to support it. Is that what you're doing? Supporting compassion? I'm supporting you, Alexander says simply. Because watching you work, seeing how you care for patients and families, it reminds me why this work matters.